All right. Well, hi, folks. Good afternoon. Thank you all for attending this webinar on forest farming specialty mushrooms. Um, Before I get started, I just wanted to thank you, for dealing with all of the security changes over the last week. I know you got probably more emails from me and Eventbrite than you wanted, but there's been a lot of changes with the sudden surge of Zoom use in the last couple of weeks, as you can imagine, and so we've been kind of rolling with the punches. If you're picking up some power tool noises in the background here, my neighbor's doing something. It's just the joys of working from home right now. Hopefully that's not too much of a nuisance. So, first things first, I haven't introduced myself. My name is Patrick Shults. I'm a forester with Washington State University Extension in Southwest Washington. So I do programming that helps small forest landowners generally. I am on a research team exploring mushroom forest farming with two other extension agents that are here with me. Stephen Bramwell. Steve, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Yeah. Hello, everybody. Echo Patrick's comments. Thanks for bearing with us on this. We all kind of learn how to use the system. But Stephen Bramwell with WSU Extension in Thurston County, and partnered with Justin and Patrick on this. And one of the three field sites for some trials that you'll learn about from Justin are at the fairgrounds at Thurston County Fairgrounds. So thanks everybody for joining.
Great. And the third party here is Justin, who will be given the bulk of the presentation today. Justin, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Yeah, so my name is Justin O'Day. I'm based out of Vancouver and obviously with WSU Extension as a regional agriculture specialist.
Great. So like I said, Justin will be doing most of the presenting today, but Stephen and I will be chiming in here and there, and then we'll all be available for questions. So a little bit of background about the webinar. This was originally supposed to be a in-person workshop where we were going to have people go through the process and actually go home with an inoculated shiitake log. As you can guess, that didn't really come to fruition in light of the whole COVID-19 crisis that we're all facing, and I'm sure you all know a lot of events have been canceled, but we wanted to move forward anyway. We transitioned it to a webinar format and opened it up to a wider audience. We had a huge response. Last I looked, I think almost 2,000 people tried to sign up for this webinar. So, or at least clicked on the registration page. So pretty significant response. We tried to limit it in order to save some of the bandwidth when we show videos and be able to answer everyone's questions and keep it as interactive as possible. But there will be a recording of this webinar available afterwards for your reference, whatever you might want to use that for if you're starting your own operation. So I will provide that link later on. So if you haven't already, you should be prompted to answer a couple of polling questions. These are just kind of helping us inform who the audience is and what your interests are in terms of mushrooms. We'll probably try to present those at some point in the presentation. Yes, I wanted to cover a couple logistical things here too before I hand it over to Justin. As you can probably tell, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you are muted and you are not able to share your video or screen. This is the best way to maintain bandwidth and make sure that things don't go crazy with people trying to talk over each other. So that'll stay throughout the webinar. You are able to ask questions though in the chat box, or there's also a Q&A function. I tend to prefer the chat box, so if you don't mind using that, please do. One thing that you have to make sure you do when you open that little chat box, there is a little tab there, and you want to make sure that you are clicking all panelists and attendees so that everyone can receive your question. We'll repeat the questions anyway, but that way everyone can kind of see what your question is. Sounds like someone is having some issues, or my voice is fading a little bit. I've had that complaint before. I think there's something to do with this microphone I bought. I'll do my best to make sure I'm audible. Fortunately, I won't be speaking the entire webinar though. Other than that, I think we're all set. Justin, do you want to take it from here?
Just one quick question, Patrick, or two before we get going. One, have you hit the record function?
I did. We are recording.
Thanks for that. And then second question, do you want to just mention anything at the outset, or Justin, about the evaluation that you'll post later on?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, so ideally, and because we're all a little bit new to Zoom, I can't guarantee anything. As soon as you close this meeting, a link will come up for an online survey, and we really appreciate you taking just a couple minutes to answer those questions. It really helps us figure out how impactful a webinar like this is. If that doesn't work for whatever reason, I will follow up with that link either tomorrow or soon thereafter, and that'll also have the link to the recording of the webinar. Okay, so Justin, do you want to go ahead and share your screen?
Sure, just a second here. Pounds on my host.
Oh, I should say too, for those of you that weren't listening to our conversation before we got started, what we're going to try to do is keep questions to immediately before the break. We'll take a break about 45 minutes in, and we'll take a little time for questions there, and then questions at the end as well. Obviously, with the chat box, we'll be able to go back and read what questions people have, but if you want to keep them until those question periods, it might be a little bit easier for all of us.
You see my screen?
Yep, looking good.
Great, great. Okay, thanks everybody for joining today. We're going to talk to you today about forest cultivated mushroom production systems. That title slide right there is actually from trials that we have in Vancouver and in the South Sound region that I'm going to get to in a bit here. But first, we're going to start with some other aspects. So again, today we're talking about forest cultivated mushroom systems. We're not going to address indoor bag systems or straw or hay bed type systems. Those are entirely different game, and we're just going to completely focus on forest cultivated systems. These are traditional systems that originally came from Japan, originally came from China, and migrated over to Japan, where they got fairly big and mainstream. And then in about the 1980s, it came over to the U.S. and started to be popularized in the U.S., especially in the Northeast and in the Midwest. Of all the universities that have done research on this in the U.S. on forest cultivated mushroom systems, probably Cornell University has been the most active, and a lot of the pictures that I'm going to show today actually come from researchers at Cornell. There's four main species that we're going to talk about when we talk about these specific systems. First one is shiitake. This is the most common, and it's the most reliable producer, and it's typically produced on what's called a bolt production system, which is depicted right here in this picture. It can also be produced on systems that are called totem systems, which are depicted down here, which are with larger diameter logs than bolts, but typically they're produced on bolts. Oysters are produced in these systems, but they're less common. Similar with lion's mane or Hericium, less common even than oyster though, And both oyster and lion's mane, when they're produced in these systems, are usually produced on totem systems. They can be produced on bolts, but typically they're produced on totems, and they have thus far shown to produce better on totems. Wine cap or stropharia, I'm going to talk about less today because we have less direct experience with it, but it's almost an entirely different system. It's a wood chip bed system, so beds of wood chips, but still forest grown nonetheless. All these species of fungi are what's referred to as detrivores or saprophytes. And what that means is they consume dead matter. Saprophytic fungi are these organisms that are just really, really well adapted to consume biomass that has a really high carbon concentration. And as you might guess, wood is something that has a really high carbon concentration. So they're very well adapted at breaking those down, and that's why they specialize in this. So wood in this case is called a substrate, otherwise known as a mushroom food. And what we're going to be talking about, all these species that we're talking about, the substrates for them are hardwoods, not softwoods. So we're really only going to be talking about hardwoods as substrates today. Thus far, at least from what's been tested, some of the more ideal species for shiitake are oaks, hard maples, hornbeams, and sweet gum. Beech and hickory has also been shown to be a good substrate for shiitake. Alder, birch, and soft maples are sort of an intermediate level substrate. And then aspen, willow, poplar, fruitwoods, white ash, black locust, and walnut are just considered generally poor substrates. Even though they're hardwoods, they're considered poor substrates for growing mushrooms, with one exception. Poplar grows oyster very well. And I should have mentioned too that oaks can be iffy with oyster. So oyster is actually like a softer type of hardwood. So probably some of you noticed that none of the species, I don't think there at least, are Pacific Northwest species, and that's because they've actually just never been tested out here. People do this as a hobby, but at least in a commercial standpoint, or doing this sort of as a small enterprise, or they've just never been subjected to replicated studies and statistics and the whole rigorous scientific process. All right, so looking at some of the qualities of the substrates that you need for these systems, logs need to be fresh cut. This is a pretty common misconception. People think, well, maybe can I use older logs that were cut last year, but they really do need to be fresh cut. The thing that happens with old logs is that, number one, they may have lower internal moisture, and moisture you're going to see is a really common theme. It's a really important aspect to these systems. The internal moisture of the log is a really important aspect. And number two, they could already be colonized with other saprophytic fungi. Typically, you want to harvest while trees are dormant. So this is before bud break in the spring. So right now we'd be a little late to be harvesting. The risk of having a late harvest is this phenomena called bark slippage, which is illustrated right here on I think that's a beech tree actually, where when the cambium of the tree is actively growing, the cell walls in the plant are very thin, and therefore they can let go of the bark easier once the tree actually begins to grow. When it's dormant, the cambial cell walls are hardened off and they hang on to the bark better. The other aspect too is that when a tree is dormant, you have all these unspent carbohydrates that are still stored in the trunk. You can think of a trunk as sort of a food storage organ for the tree. Bolts, when you're cutting bolts, you're looking for generally trees that on average are measuring 4 to 6 inches in diameter, and each individual bolt is cut at about 3 to 4 foot long. For totems, you're actually using a larger diameter tree. So you're looking from 8 to 12 on average, 8 to 12 inches on average diameter. And you're looking to cut it in length at about 2 1/4 to 2 1/2 foot long. The reason, one of the key aspects also is that the wood has to actually die before inoculation. And this goes back to the fact, again, that they're saprophytic fungi. They're not parasitic, they're not pathogenic, they're not symbiotic, and what they eat is dead wood. So that wood actually has to be dead. When the tree is actually living, there can be antifungal compounds that are still being produced by the tree, and reduced chance that you're actually going to be able to inoculate with what you want. Generally, the time for the wood to die that you want to give it is at least 3 weeks and maybe more. And what you're sort of shooting for with this is sort of this inoculation sweet spot. So you're looking for the point just after the tree has died, but before other fungi colonize it. And it's also the point when the wood's internal moisture is still at its peak. It's as high as it really can be. Once you cut logs, you might want to move them off the forest floor after cutting, because this is going to reduce risk of other fungi colonizing. It's also, you're going to want to keep it out of the sun, keep it out of the wind. You want a situation that's humid but not wet necessarily. Just a little note too, when moving the logs, mind the bark. Sometimes we would get volunteers in the trial that we're doing, that I'm going to talk about in a bit, and they're excited and they're ready to just get things done, and they're chucking logs around. But what it does is it damages the bark, and when you damage the bark, it reduces the chance that you're going to be able to maintain your internal moisture, and you lose some protection from any fungi that might want to invade besides what you want. So in lieu of us being able to do a hands-on demo due to our situation here, we put together a bunch of videos, and these couldn't be any hotter off the press. So I'm going to try these out. Hopefully they come through. This is a video of cutting bolts. So first I'm measuring here just to see what my diameter is. So that's about 15 1/2 around. That's about just shy of 5-inch diameter. On the other end here, I've got about 19 inches, which is around 6 inches. Now I'm measuring one length of bolt, targeting 48, which is 4 foot. That's where I'm going to cut. So in order to avoid splitting the bark and pinching the saw, I use these two tools, just a straight bar, just a metal bar, and a piece of wood. So what you want to do is stick the bar underneath so you can lift the log easily and not kill your back. And then you stick the wood right under where you're going to cut, because you're actually going to cut right onto it. So you just want to cut right onto the log, and this helps you avoid pinching the saw. And when I move the tree there, you can actually see that I didn't split the bark at all. Okay, I'm going to go to the next. Oops. All right, so inoculation, I'm going to go over inoculation now. So the main types of spawn that are used for forest cultivated mushroom systems are hardwood sawdust or hardwood plugs or dowels. The first one is the one that you would use if you were doing larger amounts because it's a bit cheaper, it's a bit more versatile. Hardwood plugs, in a way, can be faster, but they're not necessarily faster, and they're actually they're more suitable for if you're going to do smaller amounts of logs for home use. What these are substrates that have been inoculated with the fungal mycelium. For those of you that aren't familiar with fungi very, very well, mycelium is essentially, this is a clone of a given strain. It doesn't come from spores necessarily, which would make which would be a different strain, but it's actually a clone. So you inoculate this the spawn with this mycelium, and it grows in it, and it's a clone of that certain strain. You're going to want, if you've got to store this before you inoculate, you want to keep it refrigerated. It's recommended about up to 6 months is how long it can last, as long as you store it in a cool, dark place. And a key aspect of this too is that the mycelium is alive. You have to remember that it's alive, and you don't want to suffocate it. It needs to be able to breathe, but not dry out. Early spring is the most typical time that you're inoculating. And this goes back again to the sort of that timing sweet spot of when you want to be inoculating, when the tree dies, but before other fungi colonize it. Later can work, but sort of like I just mentioned, you get this increased risk of feral fungus and reduced yield overall. So the setup, we're going to do a bunch of videos in this, but I'm going to introduce you a bit first. The preferred setup is you want to have something that's adjacent to where your logs are and adjacent to your laying yard, which is the place you're actually going to put your logs after they're done inoculating. And the idea here is the less you have to move the logs, the better. If any of you get into this in a bigger scale, you'll start to get the idea that it's a real big plus to not be moving your logs more than needed. Another aspect is you want a covered space for spring in the Northwest. You know that rain's very likely going to come through, and you want someplace that's also got shade. Other aspects: access to electricity, drilling tools, sawbucks, or some sort of table that you can hold a log on. The inoculation tools, which we'll talk about in a little bit. That's also shown in the schematic here. Food grade cheese wax, some sort of non-flame hot plate, plus a pot or an electric pot for wax. So you're going to actually be melting wax, and you don't want to flame because wax is flammable. Also some sort of non-polyester or non-poly medium paintbrush or wax applicator, which you're going to also see upcoming here. Some sort of tables that can get wax on them, because wherever you do the waxing aspect after your inoculation, you're going to get wax all over the place. And some sort of open container for holding the spawn during the inoculation. What you're doing with the inoculation is you're actually trying to get the plug into the sapwood of the tree, which is where most of the inoculation, or most of the fungus grows. And then this is just a picture afterward of what it looks like after it's been waxed. This was our setup that we had in Vancouver. We've got sawbucks here. This is one of our bolts. You can see the bolts in the background there. This is after drilling. where we're actually inoculating, and then this is waxing after that. We've got another video here. Just took this. So I've sped up some of it. So measuring our diameter just to see how many rows we're going to put in here. Oops. Excuse me, I got to start that over again. Again, doing our diameter. I'm saying 4 to 5 inches. One on the other side is about 5.5. And I made up a chart so that I could look up rows at 2 inches. And it turns out for this log, that's 8 rows. I made these little patterns on the end. You don't have to do this, but it does kind of help you get used to how many rows there are. So this is an angle grinder with a modified drill bit. It's about a 1/2 inch wide and 1 inch long. And you're going to make offset rows. And in this case, again, I'm doing 2 inch wide or 2 inches between rows, but you can go up to 3 as well. So I'm just speeding up the process here. The angle grinder is really fast. It's about 10,000 RPM, so it goes really fast. This was Stephen and Patrick's setup. Just showing a different way that you could set it up. The pallet that they used is a really good idea. It keeps logs from rolling around. Stephen just showing, spacing those 4 inches apart, rolling the log. Taking a measurement, 6 inch diameter, and they did every 3 inches for a row, which turns out to be just about equivalent to how many inches you measured the diameter at. So 6 inches, 6 rows. This is Patrick drilling bolts for plugs with standard drill, and they use a slightly smaller bit, so that's a 5/16 bit. Oops, I see what I did. I doubled that. All right, so another video. So this is inoculating bolts. This is sawdust spawn. And what I did is I break it up in here in a bucket. And we made these gutters to put our spawn in. So it extends the length of the log. We just put it all throughout that. These are hand inoculators. So this is a palm type where you slap it with your palm. This is a thumb type. And this one is a much more elaborate, much more expensive all-in-one that puts styrofoam plugs in at the same time, so you don't have to wax. So this is the inoculation process. You fill up the inoculator and then you punch it into the hole. So again, this is the palm type. These run about 37 bucks, not too expensive. This is the thumb type being used. You can kind of see why we use the gutter, because you can just move all along. You don't have to keep reaching back to a certain point. And if you do a lot of logs, little innovations like this can be really useful. This is just a close-up. This is Patrick just dipping straight out of the bag, straight out of the spawn bag. And just another perspective, just a close-up using the thumb inoculator. This was that all-in-one that I mentioned. It is much, much more expensive, and we found it to be a little bit finicky, but it's something that you could consider. This is what it does. It puts in a little styrofoam plug. Again, it's finicky. After you put the spawn into it, it plugs it up. This is Patrick putting in peg or dowel spawn. So slightly different process. You use a rubber mallet. You can use a hammer, but you kind of want to be careful with the bark. A rubber mallet's just, you know, you don't have to be quite so careful with the bark with the rubber mallet. I don't know why all my slides are doubled up here. This is the waxing process. So this is food grade cheese wax. You're gonna get it in these big blocks, and you're gonna want to cut it up. And what we used was a electric frying pan that we just got at a thrift store. And it's nice because you can actually set the temperature. So we set it at 200 and not above. If you set it too high, it'll start to smoke. And I make sure it's fastened down because hot wax getting spilled is not a good time. So you could either use a brush, which I'm illustrating here, to do your waxing. It wastes wax, but it is fairly quick. It's a little bit crude, but it does work pretty good. This is a more specialized tool. It's called a high volume inoculator. It's also a little bit finicky, but once you get the hang of it, it works pretty well. And it holds wax in it, and it just keeps leaking out that bit on the end, which is a foam stopper. The third type you can use is just a typical cheap foam brush. I actually really like this type too. Also wastes wax a little bit, but is pretty quick, and it holds quite a bit of wax within one sitting. And then once you're done waxing, you put it in some place where you can move it easily again. So that is the full inoculation process. Again, we're all doubled up. This is just, Patrick came up with a method where he used a spoon. It's just a third or a fourth type of way that you can wax over the holes. Why you do this is it does two things. It helps sterilize a little bit because it is hot wax, but it also helps keep the fungi out, and it helps keep moisture in, which is a big plus. So these are totem systems, just showing some aspects. This is sawdust spawn in the bucket, and what you've got is sawdust in between each layer of the totem. And in between each layer, you're talking about a 1/4 inch of spawn. The size, again, is 2 1-foot pieces, and then you have about a 2-inch cap. And so what you end up with is 3 1/4-inch spawn layers in between your pieces. Some people, this is a picture from the Northeast, put a bag over the top. This helps with moisture retention and helps keep fungi out while the colonization of the log is happening after you do the inoculation. So here's our demo of the totem process. So again, we got sawdust spawn. You want to break it up in a bucket so you can spread it out evenly because it comes in a big lump at first. You're going to want to have a cup, single 1 cup. You want to figure out your size of log you're dealing with so you can get an idea of how much sawdust you're going to use between each layer. And with the one that size, I'm saying there, it's probably going to be about 2 or 3 cups. On the bottom layer, I use just about half that amount. So we've got about 1.5 cups on the bottom layer. There's 2. So I try out 2 first. It's not quite enough. So I add my 3rd cup. I probably could have got away with 1/2 cup, but 3 cups. So again, this is about a 12-foot or 12-inch wide diameter log here. 1/4 inch. 1/4. Put your next layer on. Another 2 to 3 scoops on the next layer. I like to fill it out completely so that it doesn't let air in as easily and let it dry out. And then you put your cap on top and you're done. Again, you can put something over the top to help with moisture retention and keep other fungus out too. And I should mention too that there's different things that people use as a barrier between the forest floor and the bottom of the bottom of a totem. This is weed mat, so it's a poly layer, but it's permeable. Some people use cardboard, some people use paper. All right, so the laying yard. So this is where you're going to put your logs after you've inoculated and where they're going to do their colonization aspect. So what you're looking for is shaded forest canopy, protection from direct sun, protection from drying winds. You're going to want some place that's sufficiently well drained. Some big pluses are north-facing areas, some place that's near a source of humidity, some sort of wet area or a pond. Evergreen shade is a great aspect to have because then you don't have any sunlight, or you get reduced sunlight through the canopy all throughout the year. You want some sort of protective layer between the forest floor and the logs. Really common thing that people use is pallets. You want some place for your laying yard that has access to water, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Basically, what you're shooting for with your laying yard is some place that's going to be as conducive as possible to maintaining a temperature that's between 59 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit and 80 to 85% relative humidity. And a major reason why you do this is because you're trying to, again, maintain that internal log moisture. Because once it starts to get into this range of 30 to 25%, you get closer to the danger zone of a certain fungus not being viable in that log anymore. Once you get around 23%, at least for shiitake, that's pretty much game over for shiitake. All right, so once you've got your laying yard set up and your logs are starting to colonize, the colonization period is called the spawn run. And this is typically for shiitake, this is between 6 and 12 months. It depends on where you are and how you inoculate. The harvest timing for shiitake depends on the strain. So there's a couple different types. There's cool weather, which typically fruit in fall and in spring. There's wide range, which is has a fairly wide fruiting timing. So it can be summer with what's called forced fruiting, which I'll talk about in a second here, or in fall and spring with natural fruiting, where you don't force it. And then warm weather, you can only do it in summer, and typically it's also a forced fruiting. So what is a forced fruiting? Forced fruiting is a 24-hour water immersion. The bolt should be immersed. This is best for actually saturating the log, and you want to actually purge air out of it and let water in. And what this does is it helps with producing a uniform and predictable fruiting. Typically, you can do 3 forced fruitings per season, and between each fruiting is about 7 to 8 weeks that the log actually has to rest in order to produce the next flush. So what forced fruiting does is it actually induces a physiological response from the fungus, from the quick change in temperature and in moisture, and induces fruiting from that. Wanted to note too that average log production, again, this hasn't been tested in the Northwest, so we don't know yet, but in the Northeast at least, a single good log that's been treated well can produce between 3 to 5 years on average. But again, it depends on the species, it depends on a lot of factors, but that's the average. Okay, so shiitake, this is the process that is used for harvest of shiitake. So this is what it looks like when it's fully ripe. Cap is still curled under a little bit, and typically you put them in a different formation. You take them out of crib stacks, you put them into a forced fruiting for 24 hours, and then you put them in this A-frame type of setup in order to make it easier to harvest. And then you would put these back into crib stacks while you're moving another stack into forced fruiting, and you just keep this cycle going throughout the season. On the bottom here, you can see this is a schedule for a cold weather strain and a wide range strain of shiitake. So the cold weather strain is going to fruit in spring, and it's going to be sporadic, and it's going to be a natural fruiting. So no forced fruiting with the cold weather strains, and then again in the fall. With the wide range strain, what this shows is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks. So this is 7 weeks, 7 weeks, oops, excuse me, and another 7 weeks. So this is your 3 forced fruitings of a wide range strain. And this would be the same for a warm weather strain. All right, for oyster and lion's mane, lion's mane is also sometimes called comb tooth, just so people know. This is what it looks like when it's ripe, when it's ready for harvest. For oyster, the spawn run is typically between 4 to 12 months. And for lion's mane, it's longer. It's between 12 to 18 months on average. These are produced in totem systems, so there's no forced fruiting in these systems. It's a natural fruiting, it's sporadic. Oysters typically produce in the fall and the spring, but it does depend on the strain. And again, they're ripe before the caps curl upward, similar to the shiitake. For lion's mane, they generally produce in the fall, and they're generally considered ripe when these what they call icicles are fully extended and before any browning or any desiccation starts to occur. You can see a little bit of browning has just started on this one right here, and that means it's about time that it gets harvested and not any later. Some quick notes on Stropharia. So the nice part about coupling these together is that you can use bolts for your 4 to 6 inch diameter logs. You can use totems for your larger diameter logs, and then all your branches and anything else that's left over, you can chip it up and you can use it for Stropharia. So chip up your leftover logs, and it's usually what people use is a mix of fresh cut wood chips and partially composted wood chips. Apparently, this is the only type of these 4 species that will tolerate any softwood. And Cornell has sort of figured out that about 20% softwood can work, but no more than that. You want a minimum 4 by 4 foot bed size. This is actually a 4 by 4 here. This is from Cornell. This is what they look like when they're fruiting. They're also more adapted to partial shade, but they're just starting to research this, and the ideal is not really known at this point. You can irrigate in the driest parts of summer to help keep that mycelium active and growing. Again, these also have a sporadic harvest. It's a natural fruiting, and you want to make sure to correctly identify, because there apparently are certain mushrooms that can come up in these beds that might look similar, and you want to make sure you actually have what you think you have. Hey, Patrick, I'm not sure what the time is. I haven't been tracking it, but
I was actually just about to interrupt and see if you wanted to do some questions before we take a 5-minute break. And then I think from here you get into kind of marketing and stuff. So it seems like a good stopping point.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, so we got a ton of questions in the chat box. Stephen, I think you said you were doing some copy and pasting, putting them all into one place.
Yeah, I've got a few just to see them easily, but they all are there. But I'll just mention there's some questions about hawthorn and ash kind of at the outset.
Okay, I'll go back to the top too.
I can't see the chat box right now, so you're going to have to relay them.
There was a comment on the suitability of hawthorn and ash as substrate.
Okay. Hawthorn, as far as I've ever heard, has not been tested. And then ash is typically considered a poor quality substrate. Oregon ash has never been tested, but ash in the Northeast has.
Okay.
And it does not produce well.
There was a question on just pricing, cost of a thumb inoculator, and an expensive all-in-one. I'll just answer the first part. The thumb and the palm inoculators are in the mid $30 range, but the cost of the expensive all-in-one, Justin?
Oh, I think it's like several $100s.
Great.
And you have to buy the foam plugs as well.
Okay. There was a depth of drilling hole question.
Mm-hmm.
How deep?
1 inch.
I'll comment too for the plugs. It was my understanding that you want a little bit extra space too, like between 1 and 1.5 inch, and that kind of will jumpstart the mycelium growth. It'll fill the gap. And so that's kind of what I was shooting for when I was doing that plug demo as well.
And then just a bit on the sawdust spawn. You want about something that matches the capacity of the applicator, the inoculator, but it also is something that you can kind of calibrate as you go. It seemed like I think all of us are not sort of, pros in inoculation, but you can kind of tell when it's over full and not get quite as much, and give yourself enough space so that the wax has a little bit of a reservoir to pool up in.
Yeah. So you sort of get a feel over time once you start inoculating when the inoculator actually fills up. So I usually plug it down into the spawn maybe 3 to 5 times, and then you sort of feel it fill up, and that's when you plug it into the wood. And again, it's a similar thing. It's a feel for as far as how hard you hit it. It's just a bit of practice. How hard you hit it, or how hard you press the thumb one.
Follow up for both Justin and Patrick on that note. The drill bits that are purchased from supply companies that are making this available, those tend to have a degree of depth regulation, or no?
They do. They have a collar on them, and it makes it all very quick because you don't have to worry about that aspect. So they're an inch deep and they're a ½ inch wide.
So there's good reason to get the right drill bit for the job.
Yeah.
There's also a little pilot component on those bits that pulls it into the log, so it eases the effort of needing to push down. It sucks it right into the log. Yeah.
If you think back to the demo I showed too, I mean, I sped up part of it just for time's sake, but at the beginning of the demo, that was how fast you can do it. So it goes very fast with the angle grinder and that bit.
Are there any other materials used besides styrofoam for the plugs?
No. It's one company that makes it, and it's a full package.
I had seen that maybe a little more old school. There was some cork options used in the past, and even bark, but I don't think that's common so much anymore.
No, I've never seen it sold commercially, at least.
You're probably not. Okay, good. Is inoculation without the punch successful, or just more tedious?
I'm guessing they mean just like pushing it in. It would be a lot more. Yeah, it would be a lot more tedious. I would suggest, I mean, a quicker way to do it would definitely be to go with plugs, or, the tool itself just isn't that expensive. I think it's $30 to $40. And you've got it for lifetime. Very simple tool.
Good. How about, I was wondering if you could specify, well, actually, I'll come back to that. It's something that was one of my questions. We'll stick with questions from folks. Are there other environmental factors for timing of inoculation, day length, temperature, etc.?
No. It's a matter of inoculating again at that sweet spot. So after the log is died, but before other fungus has colonized it, and when the moisture of the log is still at its top level. So you basically, you can sort of think about it as almost like gardening. So if you clear out a field, you want to plant, you don't want to wait because weeds are going to grow, right? Otherwise you're going to have to cultivate it again. So you want to plant and have your plants get a head start on the weeds. And it's the same with this. So instead of getting a head start on weeds, you're getting a head start on natural fungus that's going to invade the log.
Question about use of beeswax for sealing.
Any other questions?
Here's a question of using beeswax for sealing.
Hello?
Justin, can you hear us?
Justin might get kicked off. Patrick, do you have anything? Can you address that question at all?
I have not heard beeswax particularly. I think it probably would work. The things I've heard of staying away from in wax is any sort of, anti, or fungicidal chemical or something that would inhibit growth.
Okay.
I don't really see how beeswax would cause any problems there, though.
Justin, do we have you back?
I'm going to text him real quick.
Okay. I can continue with the questions.
Oh, he might be logging out and logging back in.
How do you measure moisture? Well, would it be advisable to wet your logs to make sure moisture is proper? I think that question was asked around the time that Justin was illustrating the inoculation. And the logs at harvest are, if you don't wait too long, they should be just fine as far as moisture content for inoculation. They're quite high. On a wet weight basis, they're around 49% for alder. On a dry weight basis, that comes out to be 100%. This relates to another question: how do you measure moisture in the logs? And the most common technique is to cut a 3-inch wafer and then dry it down. First you can wrap it in cellophane to retain the weight of the wafer or the cookie as it's wet, and collect a wet weight on it. And then you can collect, after drying it for 6 to 12 hours at 200 degrees Fahrenheit, or 93 degrees C. Then you take the difference in those and get the what becomes the water, the weight of the water. So wet weight minus dry weight, and you get the weight of the water. And then just divide that by the wet weight, and that'll give you the percent moisture content on a wet weight basis. There's also a resource we'll send out in combination with other resources after this, and that'll give some more instruction on taking moisture content. And there's also a technique for the use of reference logs that we won't go into here, but we can send that along to folks that speeds that process and gives you a non-destructive process for repeatedly taking like weekly log moisture contents.
Yeah.
I'm back.
Oh, hey, Justin.
My internet dropped and I had to reconnect everything.
Oh.
We just answered a question about monitoring moisture content in logs. You don't know what we said, but you can add anything that you'd like to.
What was the question?
How to measure moisture content in logs, and we described the use of the cookie in dry and wet.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Next question is: any luck with aspen as a substrate?
Aspen, I don't believe it's ever been tested.
Well, aspen is a type of poplar, so I imagine it's in the same.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yes and no. I mean, there's certain things like you could say similarly, like hard maples are considered a top substrate versus soft maples, which are kind of considered a dumpy one or a middle of the road.
Yeah, I'd echo that. There's a book titled Shiitake Grower's Handbook written by Paul Przybylowicz and John Donahue, and we'll send along a reference for that. But they rate aspen and poplar in the medium suitability.
Right. It would be different for oyster, probably, but.
Great. Next question. When trimming branches, should you cut with wax?
Well, Cornell did work where they waxed the end of the logs, and they didn't see a difference from doing that. Theoretically, it seems like it should, but that's what their data showed. So I think it would be similar with branches.
I saw a note in the Donahue and Przybylowicz book as well that noted putting in a couple extra inoculation holes around cuts and wounds.
Yeah,
So
that makes sense.
Speed it up. Yeah.
Yeah, we are, this year I'm going to do a minor sub-study where I'm looking at putting anchor seal on the end, which is a substance that woodworkers use to keep wood from cracking. It's just a waxy type substance, and just going to do a sub-study with that. But no idea if it's going to help or not.
Getting close to it. And Patrick, you can manage our time, but I'll ask the last couple if is that all right?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay, good. What about reishi or nameko? Same method?
They have never been tested in these systems as far as I know.
Okay.
At least they haven't been shown to be reliable in the same way that these 4 species have so far.
Okay. John Matson gave a good estimate on the inoculator with the foam plugs. I'm sure everybody sees that. And what about thimble spawn? Is a question from Philip to you.
Thimble spawn I have not used. I can't comment on it.
And then Justin, can you see the chat ones from there down? I don't want to make it too cumbersome.
I Not with my share open right
Okay,
now.
I can keep reading them. During the spawn run, do you ever spray your logs to keep them moist, i.e. summertime?
Well, we are going to get into that a little bit.
Yeah, good.
I will address that a bit.
Can any of these methods be used over in eastern Washington or just in the western part of the state?
In eastern Washington, you really run a risk of moisture management. Again, I'm gonna get into this in just a bit here. And so on the east side, you run into a lot of risk aspects, and you probably have to do a lot of artificial moisture management to keep that log moisture high enough to keep the fungus alive.
You might end up using some kind of a spawn run shelter of some kind for managing humidity and irrigation better.
Right.
And you'll get into that.
A little bit, yep.
Great. Okay, and are there any other considerations for high altitude, colder climates?
As far as I understand, it's going to be more related to the moisture than the temperature. I mean, you think about it, in the Northeast, they've got a lot colder winters than we do, and I mean, I don't know how high in elevation they're talking about, but yeah, a lot colder winters in here, and that's where these systems are more well established at this point.
And I just point people back to the ideal temperature and humidity for spawn run. So not that you can control it at all times, but when you're trying to control conditions, you have a target there that you would be shooting for. Not necessarily to elevate those temperatures all winter long, but to the extent they can be moderated, it'll help with the mycelial colonization during the spawn run. There's a couple of stacking methods. They're not really going to modify the temperature too much, but can kind of retain and protect logs. Some of the bulk stacking methods could potentially be looked at, vertical or horizontal. Anything else on that one from you, Patrick?
Well, I just say, especially in that Shiitake Growers Handbook, they kind of stress the possibility of doing this just about anywhere. But it really boils down to what kind of substrate can you source, whether or not you could find good, quality hardwood substrate, and moisture management, which you guys have already mentioned. So there are options around that, but how difficult it's going to be will change with where you are, and then that's also going to impact how economically feasible this is, especially if you're looking to make this as a source of income. If you have to have extra expenses to manage moisture, it is going to reduce your bottom line a little bit.
Great, thanks. Next question is, can you use a moisture meter?
They're considered unreliable for this application. That's the word I received from the researchers at Cornell.
Great. And they oftentimes don't measure humidity beyond that used for dry lumber evaluation is one thing, but maybe they have newer meters that could do it but are unreliable.
I don't know the details.
Okay.
That was just what was relayed to me.
Some of the common moisture meters, I believe, are more in a lower range than you'd be taking readings at for a log at say 32% moisture content.
We should probably get back on track with PowerPoint. We'll have another break for questions at the end, though. So please, feel free to keep typing them into the chat box.
A lot of good questions.
Yeah.
All right. So it looked like from the poll, not a lot of you are considering doing this as a business enterprise.
Oh, I'll go ahead and close that if you want, and maybe that'll show the results.
Yeah. So it looked like...
Can you see that now?
Yep.
I want to point out that I goofed and I did not allow for options for not growing mushrooms in some of these questions. So the data is a little bit skewed there. Apologies for that.
But we're going to put this forth in case some of you get excited about it and you start thinking about it as an enterprise. And this is partly why we're doing research too. The thing though is that it's not really intended to be a sole enterprise. Oops, hold on a second, I gotta close this. A better bet, my polls keep coming up here. A better bet is some supplemental side income or to add value to an overall business that you might have. Some options for this is if you had, say, a CSA, you could increase your palette of crop offerings, or if you had a farm market, so on and so forth. Market as forest grown, so a premium market. You can market as ecologically low impact, which I'm going to get into in a sec here. You could market the nutritional benefits. If you had a wholesale indoor production enterprise, indoor mushroom production enterprise, or you had a wildcrafted mushroom business, it might be a complement to that business, either as a premium market tier or some other kind of tier. Local markets, of course, so you could get a premium just in general, capturing a bigger share of the value chain. Restaurants, if you live in an urban area or around a place with a lot of restaurants. Also value-added products, dehydrated mushrooms, jerky. I wanted to point out too, these are probably needed anyway if you're going to do this as a commercial enterprise, because you're probably not going to be able to sell it all fresh, and you're going to want to have some of these value-added backups in place. As far as I can tell, it seems like a fairly straightforward thing to certify organically. There's just not much to compromise that certification and the standard practices that we have right now. You could go into spawn production. You could go into not variety. I shouldn't have variety there, but strain development. That's my my inner agronomist coming out there. You could also, some people do this, they sell whole inoculated logs for home use. So they'll take whole inoculated logs to the farmer's market and sell those to homeowners. So why do it then? So it looked like most of you had a forest, and so do a lot of your neighbors, and this is just one way you can produce income from it. It fits in with a comprehensive forest management plan, and often thinning hardwoods is part of that for people in the Northwest, especially that are trying to cultivate conifers. It's low impact. There's no land clearing involved in this. There's a limited amount of timber that's actually required for it. This is huge too, is that there's relatively low barriers to entry as far as the cost goes. There's just low capital needs. There's low equipment and infrastructure demands, which means the lower the investment, the lower the risk. They're generally low maintenance. There's not much land needed for a laying yard. That really works out for people who have small farms, smaller acreages, people that are operating on the urban fringe or even in urban areas. It's complementary with a lot of the beginning farmer gateway markets like farmers markets, restaurants, so on and so forth. Fits right in with produce arrays and other specialty ag products. And you can do it alone. It's something that you could do alone, or you could just do it with a few people. Also, people just enjoy volunteering for a bit. In the same respect, though, of all the things that go into it, labor is probably number one. It's probably the biggest demand. So labor could be a barrier for some people. These are just some labor and material investment estimates that Cornell came up with, such as what's it going to take to acquire 100 logs? They estimated about 17 hours. What's it going to take to inoculate 100 logs? 29 hours. you can see that the cost of what you're putting into it is not necessarily that high, but the labor can be. What this comes out to is about 17.4 minutes per log. Last year, we estimated that we did about 16.1 minutes per log, and that was one person that's going at a pretty good clip. This is actually the whole inoculation procedure. I'm going to play this. So we got logs in the back of the pickup. This is me doing the drilling. So this is sped up, obviously. There's the inoculation. You can see the way that I have it set up so everything is waist level to keep your keep any repetitive stress down, save your back. And I also have it set up so it flows from the truck to these, to the sawbucks, to this. You just roll it over here, and I'm waxing here. And after I'm done waxing, it goes straight into the wagon, which is going to go to the laying yard. Oh, I don't know why it worked that time. So what that works out to, I sort of figured this out afterward. This was a 4 to 5 diameter log that I was using here, or 4 to 5 inch diameter log, 4 foot long at a 2-inch row spacing, so the narrower spacing. Drilling was about 4 minutes, inoculating was about 5.2, and then waxing was about 4.3, which took about 13.5 minutes total. You can see that the bigger component is this component of the inoculation and waxing, but you could split it up between 3 people and it could work out fairly well. All right, so what are some of the unknowns? For the Northwest, there's a lot, actually. What's the optimal log species? Never been tested. What's the optimal log production longevity? So how long are these logs going to produce for? We don't know yet. What are the optimum strains for the Northwest? Again, we don't know yet. The potential yield, unknown. What kind of feral fungi are we dealing with? Or feral or weedy, you could call it weedy fungi too. What other pests does the Northwest have in store for mushroom growers? What about just the whole system in general? Does it need to be moisture managed, and how much? A new method's going to need to be developed. Different pest and disease management going to be needed. Any food safety issues? Are there nutritional or quality differences from forest cultivated mushrooms versus, say, bag-grown mushroom systems grown indoors? If you're doing this commercially, what's the market saturation point? What's the competition from indoor or wild-crafted mushrooms? What's the latitude of premium markets and value-added opportunities that you actually might have open to you? All these are just big unknowns right now. And partially what we're trying to do at WSU is trying to figure out some of these questions. So we put in a bioag, a 2-year bioag grant, which is actually funded through WSU. It's actually a pretty unique program and supports new enterprises like this. So we've got this 2-year funding for it, and this is the whole project whittled down into one table, and that's, I'm sure, totally overwhelming, so I'm going to try and simplify it a bit here. So we've got 2 main sites that we're doing this at. So we've got the main site, which is here in Vancouver, where I am, and then we have a satellite site, which is split between 2 locations in the South Sound region. And so we're looking at shiitake, lion's mane, and oyster, totem systems and bolt systems for the shiitake. And one of the biggest things we're doing is we're looking at moisture management. And so what we've got is we've got a control with unmanaged moisture. We've got a tarped treatment with what we call passive irrigation, which is essentially buckets for a constant source of humidity under that tarp. And then we've got a tarped plus active irrigation. And the active irrigation, we use misters that are on timers. And then the last treatment that we've got is a 24-hour immersive soak. So this is really similar to what you do for forest fruiting. So you immerse the logs in water, but you do it right after you inoculate. So you just try and give those a head start, and then we throw a tarp on top of that. The satellite sites have a more truncated version of this, which is in Vancouver. So Vancouver has a more elaborate trial, and the satellite sites are more truncated, smaller trials. So we've got, we're looking at red alder, big leaf maple, because those are our two main hardwood species. We're also looking at wild cherry because it grows around a lot of agricultural regions and around urban areas. And same with paper birch. It's a tree that grows feral in urban areas, and it's native to the northwestern part of the state too. So what we've got also is we've got a split. We're looking at two different shiitake strains in Vancouver, and this is the only part that's actually more elaborate in the satellite trials, is we're actually looking at 4 different strains in the satellite trials. All right, so this is just some pictures of our trial. This is where we got the idea that moving logs, you don't want to move them any more than you have to. There's a lot of iterations that we had to put into this. We got really in shape last summer. This is us measuring internal log moisture content. Patrick mentioned taking these cookies. So we measure this just after we cut, and then we dry these out in an oven and figure out what the total moisture content is. Just some pictures of our logs before we inoculated them. Our satellite trial site up and running. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but you typically put a tag on the end to help identify what strain you put it in, when you inoculated it, so you can figure out how old it is and when you might need to harvest it. These are our buckets and our passive irrigation treatment. And we have data loggers capturing temperature and humidity data in each of our stacks. And then this, which I don't hope you can see, is a little weather station that takes the full conditions of each of our trial sites. This was our tarp over the top, which we actually changed because it came, we learned fairly fast that this treatment was actually keeping it a bit too wet. And we were starting to get fungal growth that wasn't what we want on the log surface. So we kicked the polytarp out of the trial, and what we ended up is putting this material. This is a spun polyester that's typically called remay. It's used by market gardeners and gardeners often, and we used it because it reflects sunlight, as you can see here, when the sun shines on it. And it's also permeable and it's breathable. So it should mitigate moisture loss, but not hold in moisture too much like the original tarp did. In Vancouver, these are some of the other moisture management aspects that we used. So this is the active irrigation. This is our mister, and we actually have it spraying onto the remay instead of directly onto the log. And this is soaking our logs in our soaked treatment. And here are our buckets that are actually going to go underneath remay that's going over our totem system. This is just the full trial in Vancouver. Actually, this is half the trial, but we have 2 different locations. One of them is a drier location on a hilltop, and then the other one's down below in a more stagnant, static location. On the top of the hill, we just get a lot of wind, and this is our weather station just showing that we should get some really good data out of this, because one of the locations is pretty darn dry, and then the other one is a lot more moist. And a lot of you have probably been asking this question the whole time. So why the heck are we managing moisture again? Doesn't the Pacific Northwest just guarantee this steady drip? Kind of. So we're plenty humid during the winter. What we've got on the side here is we've got Vancouver's weather data compared to Ithaca, New York, which is where it's where Cornell is, and where a lot of these systems were refined for the Northeast. And if you look at the humidity levels, you get this pronounced dip in midsummer of humidity during midday, especially. Whereas in the Northeast, that generally doesn't happen. We also get this drop in precipitation, we get a drop in cloudy days, and we get a peak of sunshine all throughout the summer. This kind of happens in the Northeast, but not to a pronounced degree. And precipitation is actually the total opposite. They get most of their precipitation in the summer. So actually a pretty different situation. And when you get into this midsummer aspect, your logs can sort of get in that danger zone. So I don't know how many people have heard of the concept of that I'm putting forth here, which is equilibrium moisture content. And what that is essentially that at a given temperature and a given humidity, a given substance can only be so moist. So let's take, for instance, 80 degrees or 80% relative humidity at 50 degrees. And you go up on the chart, and what it's saying is that wood can only, will reach equilibrium at 14.9% moisture. And I mentioned before that you want your wood to be above 25% in order to keep your fungus viable. And you'll notice that that only happens when you're keeping your logs at about 98% all the time at any given temperature. So these are all above 25%, which is probably pretty impractical, right? Especially during the summertime here. But what it really highlights is that managing moisture in dry, warm weather conditions means managing relative humidity to minimize these low equilibrium moisture content conditions. And that soaking logs for forest fruiting is probably going to be a really important part in replenishing that internal log moisture. So these are just some pictures of some of the issues that we've encountered so far. Animals, feral fungi of different types, wood-boring beetles. This is probably birds. So a lot of unknowns. We did get a surprise harvest of lion's mane, but we think it was just from the spawn. Primarily, though, it was interesting because it just showed up on our cherry treatments and the ones that we had also pre-soaked. But we don't really have the details yet, so just stay tuned on that. We actually just had a harvest of a couple shiitake this spring too. All right, so just some heads up on this whole process. Felling timber and moving logs is dangerous. Be careful. Chainsaw safety, chaps, helmets, gloves, face guard, steel-toed boots, all pretty essential for this. Remember to keep a sharp chain. Know the danger pitfalls of felling a tree. Make sure there's no people around. Make sure you're not hitting power lines, so on and so forth. know that you're going to trip a lot in the woods, and you're going to learn to curse trailing blackberry. Move logs with respect for their weight. Watch your fingers, watch your feet, watch your head, and the helpers that you're working with too. Watch your back, lift with your legs. You'll definitely get in shape if you do a lot of these and you're not in shape already. If you're doing a lot of inoculation, take breaks, rotate jobs, just to avoid repetitive stress because there's a lot of repeating. Be careful with hot wax and flammability, and know that in the Northwest, there's just a lot to learn about this still. So that's the end. These are some select resources that, that we've been using so far that can probably help you out with the whole process. But other than that, I think it's time for more questions.
Great. Yeah, I thought, I think I was working with a different version of the PowerPoint. I thought it was going to take a little bit longer, but we do have some more questions. Let me look back and see what we've got here. One from Abba Kaiser. Have you all worked with fungi perfecti in Olympia for Pacific Northwest data? That's a good question.
They were included as a partner on this project. A pretty light role though, and we included them because we wanted to consult with them and talk with them about what they produced so far as spawn goes. Because right now they're one of the few local companies that would be or could be a supplier for something like this. And they have a lot of experience in mycology. But yeah.
This is just a comment from Lauren. She has had problems with pill bugs, slugs, squirrels, possibly deer, all coming after her shiitake. So thank you for that comment. That is really interesting. We have not gotten to the point where we've had any mushrooms eaten yet, I don't think, Justin.
No. Though I noted that the remay is sort of a protective layer. So I'm hoping in that regard it could help. They actually use something really similar to that in the Northeast and the Midwest called fruiting blankets, and that's just to protect and keep humidity while fruiting is occurring. But we're taking that a lot further out here. So you kind of get it by default if you're using remay the whole year anyway.
Yeah. I'll say too, I know a few farmers that have used ducks to control slugs.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
It's pretty effective. Apparently you do not want them out there though while your logs are fruiting because they can cause damage to the mushrooms.
Yeah, and if you're selling logs, got to watch food safety issues.
Right.
Patrick, is your cooperator grower in Elma or McCleary? I can't remember the site where it's located. Had trouble with deer on predating on shiitake?
No problems with deer. I think he has had some problems with squirrels and had a lot of problems with slugs. So his method was to raise all of his stacks on concrete pillars with like a little iron arm that holds the base logs. And he wraps copper wire around the base of those. And it's done pretty well for him so far. The copper wire just prevents the slugs from being able to climb up. Let's see here. These moisture maintenance plans are specifically for the fruiting and season point, not during the spawn run. Correct. Actually, no. The moisture management that we're testing is actually for the spawn run. Yeah. It's
through the whole season.
Yes, throughout the entire process.
But especially for those dry summer periods. Dry, warm summer periods where humidity can get pretty low.
All right, question from Philip. Did you check your moisture measurements against a wood moisture meter? We did not use a meter, I don't think, in any of our tests, did we, Justin?
No, Patrick or Stephen mentioned this before. The word from Cornell was that the moisture meters for this application weren't accurate enough.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they used the cookie method with the oven.
We got a question about the metal tags we use, and I cannot remember where we sourced those. Do either of you guys remember?
You can source them from suppliers. They come from the same places that you can get the tools and the spun and so on and so forth. But I think you can just get aluminum tags in general.
Yeah, I'm sure there's different suppliers out there, research suppliers.
And those are really common in orcharding for tags, and so you can get them, and you just staple them on, and then use a bluntly sharpened pencil to emboss them with your information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they work really well. Forestry suppliers would have them too, I think. What about propagating native fungi in their natural habitat?
Unknown.
Yeah.
Maybe. That's one of the reasons why we thought, having a company like Fungi Perfecti involved could be something that was productive. That's all they do.
Mm-hmm.
They're focused on mushrooms and might have some insight into other species, other systems that might be developed if in a collaborative relationship like this.
In one of the strains that is in the trial, CS41, I don't know what the name is, but it's from Fungi Perfecti, right?
Right.
Range strain.
Yeah, I believe they only sell one strain of shiitake, and that's the one. It's the CS41. It's a
that's correct.
Wide range strain.
But strain is a lot like the fruit variety. You could certainly, blind squirrel can find an acorn every once in a while, but just sort of haphazardly grabbing for a native species or a new fruit type, randomly from a crab apple is going to have a really low rate of success.
Mm-hmm. Tracy has a question about, I guess, probably asking whether or not we've had any or heard of any success doing this in Southern California.
I haven't heard of forest-grown systems in Southern California. I'd have the same concerns about moisture retention during the summer because it's also a Mediterranean climate with a pronounced dry summer.
Right. Yeah, I can't say I've heard of anything down there either.
In Japan, they'll couple these systems with sort of indoor controlled systems where they'll use hoop houses, and they'll use hoop houses sort of like a shaded hoop house, like what do they call them? A humidity tent.
Mm. Right, Tara asked if we were including morels in our research. The short answer is no. I think there'd be a lot of money for a quick and easy way to grow morels out there.
Yeah,
if that could happen.
I don't personally remember either if morels are a saprophytic fungi or if they're a symbiotic one.
Wow.
So it might be, if they're symbiotic, it might be difficult, kind of like truffles are difficult to cultivate because it's a lot harder to control the system.
Yeah, they are saprophytic, but it hasn't been figured out how to cultivate them.
Okay.
Is there a way to combine a mushroom growing system into a vegetable growing system for mutual benefit? And the example he gives here is soil mycelium.
Kind of. The Stropharia that I didn't talk that much about, but those wood chip beds are sort of, at least the habitat's a little bit more similar. You could compost the mushroom or compost the wood chips over time, and eventually, once they were completely composted down, I guess you could use those in a garden. Mycelium wise, it's not, I don't know, maybe they meant
Mycorrhizal.
mycorrhizae, yeah, which is not, it's not the same thing. Mycorrhizae are a type of fungi that grow on roots, and they're specific. That's a specific type of fungus, and all of these ones that we're talking about are not mycorrhizal
Right.
fungi. They're saprophytic fungi.
All right. Valerie asks, what happens if you get some feral fungi on a log?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I've heard everything from, if it's covering X% of the log, just get rid of the log, to oh, they'll get over it.
Yeah, me too.
So I really don't know, and it's something that we're not directly testing it, but we're doing observations on it so we can do studies in the future.
Yeah, and I'll say too, everything, all the research and reading kind of suggests that, you know, even if you get feral fungi, something like trichoderma, that, you know, gets into your logs, you probably still will be able to get a shiitake harvest. It just may be reduced. And if you're just doing it at a hobbyist level, probably not that big of a deal. If you're trying to make money off this as a commercial enterprise, that could be a big deal over the long term.
Right.
Yeah. There is a fairly wide range of recommendations of, how clean to be. We've seen in some of our research recommendations that, all the logs should be cleaned with a pressure washer beforehand. You saw photos and video here today with, moss. And in some instances, people will say, sterilize, and even have two different people, one person doing the drilling and a different person whose hands are clean doing the inoculation, and then all the way to the more permissive end of things where there's less stress on those items. So just wanted to mention that. And we have had some trichoderma issues on some logs that were tarped initially, Justin mentioned. So we're going to be really curious. And that was right at spawn inoculation, at a time when the spawn was presumably at its most vulnerable to being outcompeted by trichoderma. So, we'll be watching those. We don't have a quantitative approach to rank them, but we'll keep an eye.
Yeah,
definitely. I'll say too, one of the things that I read was some anecdotal evidence that with the plugs, because you're handling them so much more with your hands as opposed to the sawdust, that there's actually can be higher rates of contamination down the line.
Okay.
Of course, that was totally anecdotal, but it's something to consider, especially you are handling it a lot more than your sawdust.
Right.
All right, so Kim asks, best source to buy spawn.
We have to kind of refrain from recommending anybody. The thing that I typically tell people is search for sawdust spawn, shiitake, and it should help at least get you started to some companies, and you can sort of gauge how serious they are about their game by the array that they might be able to offer, the array of maybe supplies or strains or so on and so forth. Then again, maybe you want to do something local and not hinge on that too. In which case you just search those general terms to get you started, and then a certain location like Pacific Northwest or Washington, Oregon, something like that.
So we got a, I lost my spot here. Oh, are you scoring for mushroom quality in addition to yield? And what are the metrics of quality? That is a good question.
We haven't explicitly lined out any quality parameters. We were looking at just yield, but I have a feeling that we're going to end up doing that anyway.
Yeah. And I'll say too, I mean, some of the general metrics for, what's more valuable from a shiitake is things like, well, if the caps are cracked, they're less valuable. If they're harvested a little too late, they're like a little over mature. I know that can make them less valuable. Even moisture, if they're wet, it's one of the reasons you want to protect them from the rain when they're fruiting. Is they're, from a value perspective, these are all different.
Right. And there was a question way back that I realized I didn't quite directly address. Somebody talked about spraying your logs directly during the spawn run. It's something that you could do, but Cornell did that actual method and they couldn't find a difference just from doing that. I thought about this because if you think about when you spray on a log, really what you're doing is you're wetting the surface. It dries fairly quickly, and you're probably just getting the surface wet. So you might not be aiding the inside that much. And that's one reason why we decided to go with that soaking treatment in the beginning also, was that we actually immerse the log and we make sure that water is getting inside the log versus just trying to spray them. And then everything else that we're trying to do with our moisture mitigation is manage humidity so that moisture is less likely to leave the log once it's in there.
So we got another regional question here that I think I might have skipped previously. Sorry for that. I live in Salt Lake City. Does this apply to zone 4, or should I do more to keep the logs moist?
If you were in Salt Lake, yeah, you would probably have to manage your moisture pretty intensely.
Yeah.
Pretty deliberately.
And one approach for doing that is to after an irrigate, if you're going to choose to have active irrigation, you want to see what the resulting effect on the logs is. So trying to get a moisture content, in some period after the irrigation, because then you'll have a sense. And I think that's kind of the back and forth that makes that an art in addition to a science of kind of seeing the effect of your management within your particular microenvironment on that log moisture content.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there's a correction too, I'll note as well, that in the past, morels have been thought to be saprophytic, but actually it's more commonly understood they're mycorrhizal now. So,
okay.
Duly noted. Yeah.
Nice. Fact check.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's an interesting question. This is from someone that lives in North Idaho on a small lake. They're wondering if beavers could be a problem.
Never heard of that.
Yeah, me either.
Not in the Northeast either, where there's beavers about.
Yeah, I don't think they would be interested in the downed, relatively short bolts. Typically 3 to 4 feet.
Yeah.
I've never heard of any issues. Okay, so fresh shiitake are for sale right now at $5 a pound. What sort of prices? Seems pretty cheap. What sort of prices are you expecting for your mushrooms?
It all depends on how you market it. The book that was written by the Cornell researchers gives certain numbers for how much to sell direct market and for a premium. So the price that they're quoting, I'm sure, it's more of a wholesale price for an indoor grown shiitake.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to be even close to competitive with that, you really would have to develop a second tier of market as a forest grown mushroom, as a low impact mushroom, and direct market it too, so that that's all coming back to you and not going to a mid-level wholesaler as well.
Right.
Whether or not you value add, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a study out at University of Vermont that quoted about $5 a pound and then noted that Vermont log-grown shiitakes, people were able to market just in the way that you're describing, Justin, at about $15 a pound. I mean, obviously we're not saying that's, guaranteed, but there's some opportunity there for
that
designation.
It's about what kind of opportunity. Yeah, you take advantage of and what kind of opportunity you just have or don't have.
Okay, Becky asks, if one is trying to decompose old partially decomposed lumber piles, would you recommend covering with chips and inoculating with Stropharia or another species?
I don't know if I could answer that very, very well.
Yeah, I think that's
I
tough.
wouldn't necessarily, recommend Stropharia for something like that, but if you did it right, maybe it could work out. There's a lot of details in there that it would be hard to figure out.
I imagine it would depend too on how decomposed they already were. If they're
Right.
already chock full of other fungi,
Mhm. Yep.
that would be tough.
How much softwood is in there?
Yeah. Let's see here. Seen people comment about magic mushrooms. That's pretty funny. Let's see here. Did you characterize the species of Trichoderma? We have a grad student working on that to suppress the fungi that grow with ISHB.
No, we didn't characterize it. We didn't know what to expect with regard to what fungus would come in, and we don't have a budget for doing something like that, but
Yeah.
that could be a good connection.
Will you be sending this PowerPoint to us? I can field that one. I wasn't planning on sending out the PowerPoint, but this is going to be recorded, and that link will be made available for sure. I guess we could discuss giving out the PowerPoint in a PDF format.
out.
Yeah, we could do that. We'll be putting together some resources to follow up with for sure. All right, one more question. Looks like we are close to soaking our logs for the first time soon. The worry is knowing for sure that the mushrooms we inoculated with will. Okay, I'm sorry. The worry is basically whether or not they're going to grow something that would be bad to eat. How do we know that they're safe?
It's a good question. I mean, they should look. I'm nervous about giving any advice that's close to identifying without actually seeing. They should definitely look like what you inoculated your logs with.
Sure. Yeah. You could spend some time just looking at healthy shiitake pictures. There is a pub that we'll probably end up sending out that talks about some of the things that can cause, rotting shiitake, or even look-alike fungus that might have gotten into your logs. So maybe that will be of some use. But that's definitely a tough question to field. We wouldn't want anybody to get sick.
Yeah. And I don't know of any resources out there that highlight what species might be lookalikes. The only one that I've heard of that you had to be careful with was Stropharia.
Okay. I think the Gabriel one talks a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Oh, it looks like we've got a couple more questions. Can you speak to any dormant periods for the logs? Specifically, how does winter weather affect if there is snow?
Yeah, they're dormant throughout the winter. If the snow, it's a period where you're not losing moisture. It doesn't necessarily hurt it. It just shortens the growing season. Mm-hmm. Again, these are grown in the Northeast. They're grown in Japan where it's colder than it is here, and they do fine. It's just a shorter growing season.
Yeah.
Same with zone. Someone mentioned zone 4 before, and it's just a matter of a shorter growing season and getting the right strain.
Another one here. Will you update us on your research findings and data?
For sure.
Yeah, definitely. We definitely intend to generate some sort of publication out of this, whether that's video or manual, or we've talked about a lot of different ways to deliver this information.
Yeah.
I missed a couple over here in the question and answer function, but I think there's only really one. Do the substrates need to be pathogen free?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
They do. Well, what they do is they sterilize the substrates before they inoculate them. I think they're talking about the spawn, at least. The substrate is whatever the mushroom grows on.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're not going to sterilize the log.
I think this was an early question before you got into selecting trees, and they might have been wondering whether or not you could inoculate a log that was already down and had some fungus in it.
No, I just generally wouldn't recommend doing that.
Yeah.
Because the likelihood that the part of the wood is dead already and invaded by secondary fungi is higher, and there's a chance that it's going to have less moisture too if it's not growing as healthy. So, yeah.
All right, well, that's all the questions. Do you have any wrap-up comments? Stephen, anything you want to add before we close out?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Okay.
I think this has been a great interaction. A lot of good questions and a lot of interest.
A lot of good questions.
Yeah, great questions. All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, Justin, nothing else. Thank you all for attending. I just want to say before you log out, please take 2 to 3 minutes or however long. It's a short survey to fill out the questions or answer the questions that pop up as soon as you leave here. And again, if that doesn't work, I'll definitely be sending a link to that survey out along with the video and the additional resources that we already talked about. So
WSU takes those very seriously. They help us keep our jobs too.
Yes, that's a good point.
In addition to help us just get better at what we do.
And just a big thank you to everybody who attended who's still on. So it's great.
Yeah, thank you everybody.
Topic. It's really confirming.
Yeah.
It is. It is.
All right, great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and stop recording.